Tape number 2. We're continuing with our story of Elijah, the father of Petroleum. Now, we left off on our last tape, and we told about how Elijah was going back to the capital to not only challenge the authority of this king who was married to this whore, priestess, prostitute, to put it just as nicely as I can. Now, I got that out of my system to show that they were following a false god, and that her several hundred whores and other degenerates that followed them and claimed how powerful their god Baal was. Well, excuse me, we have to consider, I don't care how much intestinal fortitude that you have, but Elijah here made Rambo look like a piker, my friends. When you go down and you challenge the government and the cavalry, the army, the church and the political, see, this is a type and allegory of what is going on to our day, those of us that snivel and whine and moan and groan and ask, how long, O God, how long? Because we know that this godless world order that is ruling over us, that's diametrically opposed to the statutes, judgments, ordinances, ritual, and sacrifice. We even have our own preachers. Most of them are sincere and honest men, and they're not aware that they're preaching the doctrines of Baal, denying that the laws of the Almighty are still in effect. And as I said before, I get very confused. One minute they say, hey, honey, if you don't pay the tithes, you're not going to be blessed. And I said, well, that's Old Testament law, and you said they were all done away with. They don't want that one done away with. Well, anyway, we're going off on a tangent, so here we see Elijah. He's going back to the capital of this nation to challenge both the political and the so-called religious, and prove once and for all who the Almighty is. And we find that there wasn't any water to speak of in those districts, and so we have Elijah taking his own back with him, and some very mysterious jars with some very mysterious water. My friends, you might get out your encyclopedia, your dictionary, and you look underwater, and everybody says, well, that's H2O. My friends, there's all type of water. Anyway, that's later on in our story. So he was soon to appear here before the capital, and he was provided with several jars filled with water. Mysterious water. Elijah said that there was no water in the district. It was an actual fact. And these jars that we believe that he took with him, they contained a very special liquid which is very flammable, taken from an oily substance. This petroleum, or this material, shall we say, it was found in the soil where those ancient wells were dug, and only a very few initiates, those that understood the secrets, knew about this special type of oil and its mysterious properties. My friends, they were not all a bunch of dumb goat herders and sheep herders. When you have extraterrestrial messengers coming from space and teaching you science and technology, you listen. Now, we go back to a book that was written about 110 years ago, and there was quite a biblical archaeologist. You've heard me talk about him many times, and in the future, God willing, we're going to bring out a lot more of his discoveries, but his name was George Smith. It was a Chaldean account of Genesis, and he didn't know what he was doing for us at this age, but he went into quite lengthy details speaking about what they thought was the remains of the Tower of Babel, or Babel, whatever you prefer. But I believe that story is a farce concocted by organized religion because they didn't understand what it really was and what was going on. But that's a whole other story we'll have to leave alone. Now, he made an account back then, 110 years ago, that there was an oily, tarry substance that they found back then, and it was described as bitumen, which is called an oil byproduct of petroleum and asphalt. After much discussion, if you were to reason with me for a minute, the account says that there was every kind of nation at this Tower of Babel, and they would have us believe the account that all of these people were finding more and more that they had technology. We find a mystery today as to how they built some of these great edifices, and they accomplished a lot of these things. Now, back in those days, and in the days of the Egyptians, they had quite extensive knowledge even of brain surgery and other things that are mind-boggling to, well, at least they convinced me that if you get all these people together and you try to get me to believe that they could build a tower that would climb to heaven, this is beyond the scope of my imagination, because mathematically they had some architecture, even in the days of Rome, that today we would have great difficulty in duplicating, and our architects have long lost the science and the abilities they had in their architectural. So if they would sit down and figure it out mathematically, if you start with a base, let's say 100 miles across, and you would have to keep making each one smaller and smaller as you went up, I think that they could figure how high they could go in the structure without it wobbling. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous, the connotation and the reasoning that has been put on it by the religious world. No wonder the scientific world denies. They don't even want to consider some of this stuff that sounds so utterly ridiculous. But now I don't think you could even get a little kid today to believe this story, especially in light of our Star Wars technology. And they found out about this Tower of Babel, and the main point was the bitumen, the petroleum byproduct. As we go back to the book of Enoch, which I think the reader or the listener, shall we say, when he finishes with that book, he would have an understanding of the clouds, that it meant something more than these extraterrestrials teaching about weather clouds. We're talking about extraterrestrial vehicles, as we've shown, that were described as clouds. We read in the book of Enoch, it talks about these angels that came down and they taught the children of Adam enchantments, astrology. Now, possibly, this was a bastardization of the word astronomy. As I said, they taught them the mysteries of the clouds. Now, there's no mystery about clouds. Everybody knows that rain comes out of them. Now, if you're talking about extraterrestrial vehicles, that would be reasonable. As we find down through the different stages here of the biblical history, they always have these falling Nephilim, if you like, or Raphaim, or fallen angels. And is it not possible, is what I'm trying to say, that they were teaching the men on this planet the knowledge of the clouds? They try to teach them how to build a launching pad or a tower like we have in Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy. They can't seem to make up their mind which they want it to be, where we launch our space shots from. And remember when I quoted to you the Mahabharata, and a lot of you years ago when you heard me speak about this, and here today in our war with Iraq, they're talking about smart bombs. You see, just an exact repetition of what happened back then. And we talk about these missiles, these Scuds, which is supposed to be the Russian rendition, meaning a whale. Can you imagine 2,000 years from now if we annihilated ourselves, we started over from the Stone Age, and then 2,000 years from now here'd be some ignorant, pious, pontificating priest of the priestcraft says, here's my chance to start getting a few extra loaves of bread in my closet and wear some better clothes, getting them to tithe to me. I'll stand up. Thus saith the Lord, back in the days of Iraq and its conflict with the North Americans, they had a secret weapon. They called it the Great Whale. Here's some of the interpretation. And they used to hide him in the ditch. He would go out and kill some of their army. Then they would hide him and camouflage him. And then we talk about, today we say our tomahawks, another type of missile. Can you imagine? They talk about there was men so powerful in the age of 1991 that they could throw a tomahawk from one nation to another. So when a lot of people go back and they read the Mahabharata, and it talks about smart bombs, it talks about rockets, It talks about sound-seeking missiles, and it speaks about flying cities that were so big. Then the next minute it talks about men that had javelins and swords. Well, my friends, why would they go from the technological of great advanced science and then go back and start talking about primitive weapons? Well, my friends, just like today, we're just naming them after primitive weapons, saber jets, different types of jets and so forth. Now, even those are outdated. So actually, the people back in this area, they were building a type of launch pad. We're told that the Almighty and His angelic hosts, they interceded and they destroyed it before it got finished. Now, why would they have to, if it was just a bunch of stairs climbing up into space, why would the extraterrestrials be so concerned about it and come down and destroy it? Think about that for a minute. I'd like to refer you to a book that was entitled Gems and Minerals of the Bible that was written by Ruth B. Wright and Robert L. Chadbourne. Under the title bitumen, originally a name for mineral pitch or asphalt, is now applied to several mineral substances that are inflammable, such as tar and naphtha, which I believe can become a very volatile substance. I remember years ago, my stepfather, he was in the dry cleaning business, and they used this very volatile material in his business to take out spots, and being around this substance can make your head reel, and it could be very dangerous and very explosive. Now let's go back for a minute to Genesis 11:3. They quote to us from the Revised Standard Version. They say one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Now the bricks of the Tower of Babylon were joined together. In other words, they used this sticky asphalt as mortar between the bricks. And they go on and they talk about the ark. Now, whether it was a box or the Ark of the Covenant or atomic reactor or a coffin, all of these were defined as an ark. That's where people get confused. And even this basket that Moses was supposedly put in, and they said he floated down the river, he never did. His mother put him in this basket sealed with this bitumen or this oily substance. And as we said before, this was how H.L. Hunt became a multimillionaire. He broke these words down, went over in the land. Sure enough, just like the Bible said, there was this pitch or bitumen in the land. He sunk the oil wells, and that was one of the beginnings of America and our giant oil companies getting us involved in the Middle East. But anyway, so we find that the great fiery furnace that was to supposedly or supposed to incinerate old Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it was fired by the very same product along with other materials. We find the Egyptians, they used it in embalming in their early age, and it wasn't unusual for neighboring nations even to go and wage great wars with each other over the possession of the land where this bitumen was plentiful. And some archaic terms are asphalt. Actually, the best waterproofing agent that is known to man, and it has the additional desirable qualities of being acid resistant. It serves well as also as an adhesive, and in biblical writings it's also referred to as pitch or slime. Sometimes there's a difference between these two, but some have been found floating on the surface of the Dead Sea and the nearby marshes and so forth. And so the Jerusalem Bible presents the story quite interestingly. To the Earthman spoke the same language as and the same vocabulary. As they moved eastward, they found the plain or the land of Shinar where they settled. And they said one to another, "Let us go and make fire and bricks," and so forth. And then we go to Genesis 11:1-4, according to Herodias, who lived around 485, 425 BC, that the city of Babylon was entirely encompassed by a moat and a double wall, and the earth excavated from that moat was made into bricks and fire and used in constructing these great walls. And the moat was interwoven reeds placed in between every 13 courses of brick, and they heated this bitumen up, and it used it as a cement between the brick pours that they brought in from the small tributaries of the Euphrates River. Now we go back and we find even that in ancient, the Ashur, the ancient capital of Assyria, 60 miles south of ancient Nineveh, their walls were similar to this. Both the Egyptians and the Sumerians, they were superlative artists, and they created extreme lifelike statues of human figures, and great care was given to give a natural facial expressions, and some of the materials used very unusual. People find that they made artificial eyes, and some, like Sumerian heads, that the eye sockets were hollowed out and filled with a capsule of this bitumen, and seashells were used to make the whites of the eyes, and the bitumen was used to form the pupils. Now these materials, they were embedded in the bitumen capsules and so forth. Needless to say, they left some very strange-looking eyes. In fact, you go back to the time of Cleopatra here, one of the most extravagant gifts that was given to her was a land that was ample or could supply ample or endless quantities, shall we say, of asphalt, was given to her by none other than Mark Antony, and was suggestively described only as a gift worthy of a queen. So you can see what they thought of it. Now, in case you're lost, let's go back to my documentation for 2 lines. Bitumen was a name used for material pitch for asphalt, now applied to several mineral substances that are inflammable, such as tar and naphtha. And this is where I believe Elijah was shown these things by the extraterrestrial. We refer to Webster's dictionary. We find how it defines the term. It is from the Greek of Iranian origin. They go on to say akin pernift naphtha is petroleum. 2, they say any of various volatile, like flammable liquid, hydrocarbon mixtures used chiefly as solvents and dilutants. So now we go back to Elijah and his knowledge of this volatile material, and it could be a very explosive material. Now we equate it to gasoline today, and we find that as he reached Samaria, Elijah told his friends to conceal his precious load and then make their way to the palace. And we find that he was followed by a great wandering crowd that wanted to see what was going to go on, and Ahab received him into his apartment and greeted him with this false cordiality. And we find in 1 Kings, referring to Bibles other than King James to back up our story. Anyway, the king goes on, and he said, "There you are at last, you troubler of Israel." And the man of Yahweh that was clothed in the animal skins, he retorted, "Not the least was he taken back. The troubler," he tells the king, "is you, sir. You and yours. You have abandoned Yahweh in order to follow Baal, and I swear by the living whom I serve, there'll be no rain during these years except at my command." Now Ahab was ready to undertake anything in order to obtain water for himself and his nations. Just not only needed, but he had to save his ego. He crossed his arms and said, "I'm listening. Tell me what to do." Now we find the next morning that the white and the purple and the yellow tunics of the crowd were to be seen on the side of Mount Carmel. Criers there, they assembled the people at the order of the king, was that Elijah was to speak to them. "How long," he cried, "and how long will you hold up between 2 opinions? If Yahweh be God, follow him, and if Baal be God, then you follow him." This is a repetition of what Moses said, the same exact thing to the people. So we see extraterrestrials intervening in both instances. But I don't want to play prophet, but I believe that this nation will be on their knees, and we will repeat this very much the same thing is coming in our day. This is why I've gone into great detail on this, because I think if you will listen and understand, there's many lessons that we're to learn by this great historical account. And is there among us, like he said, there's yet 7,000 in the land, is there prophets, is there men of God out there that at this last hour that will stand up and encourage us till the Almighty's imminent return? But here we find that the crowd, they remained silent. So Elijah proposed a trial of strength. He was alone, and alone on the side of God. There was 450, I believe it was, of these pious pontificated would-be puffin prophets of Baal, and they said, "Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on wood, and put fire under it. And I will dress," and put no fire under it, I mean to say, "and I will dress the other bullock, and I'll lay it on wood, and put no fire under it. Now you call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of Yahweh. The God that answers by fire, let him be God." So there was a lot of murmuring going on among the people. So Elijah was acclaimed by everybody. Elijah had spoken, and it would be best to obey and see on what side lay the truth. So Elijah here, he turned towards those long murmuring among the people, and soon Elijah was acclaimed by everybody, and he spoke up and he said it'd be best to obey to see which side lay the truth. So Elijah turned towards these pontificating priests of Baal and said, "Choose 1 bullock for yourself and dress it for your many." And those 450 prostitutes, they did what they were told, and they had a bull that they chose to sacrifice, and he was put on a pile of wood, and he was dedicated to this Baal. And then their incantations began mixed with dancing and the bowing of the knees, and the people together with the royal family, they watched closely. They were looking for at least a spark or a flame, but no flame or fire rose. I bet they were walking around wishing they had a 5-gallon can of gas and a Zippo lighter. But even with all that wailing and moaning and a snot of flying, they couldn't seem to get anything out of their God. So Elijah, he began to mock them, and he went on to say, "Now, he is a God, how come he's not talking?" Well, I tell you what, one Bible I don't want to recommend, but it's, what's this modern Bible? Went blank there for a moment. The Living Bible in there. This man took it upon himself. I thought it was rather clever, but he has no basis of it. He said that Elijah challenged him and said, "What's wrong with your God?" as he's sitting on the toilet. But anyway, so we find Elijah, he went on to mock him and say, "Now, if he's a God, how come he's not talking? Is he pursuing, or is he on a journey, or is he sleeping? Maybe you better wake him up." So around about midday, the priests began to stab themselves and cut themselves. The blood was flowing all over the place, and there was neither voice nor roll of thunder or any kind of reply. So then these servants of the Baal, they suddenly stopped, and they began to talk in small groups. Meanwhile, we find Elijah and his companions, they put 12 stones of which was a reminder on Yahweh's altar of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they dug a ditch all the way around it, and they filled the trench with water. As the King James said, but he said this Naphthalim. Well, what I'm trying to say, the King James Version says he put water in it. Now, does that make sense to you? No, my friends. He was filling this ditch underneath these logs that some maintain, some historical writers say were the size of telephone poles, all the way around, stacked in a big square, and there was a ditch underneath, and he filled it with water. At least the audience and those watching thought it was water. But, my friends, I believe beyond the shadow of a doubt that he had filled it with this type of water. We're going to get into that, this Naphthalim, or naphtha, I mean to say. He poured the water into the trenches that he had the prophets bring him. Then he dismembered the bull and put it on the wood, and he sprinkled it and turned, and the people thought he was out of his tree, that he'd gone nuts. But then his invoking fire from heaven, he starts to drowning the offering, and at a time when water was more precious than gold. But the prophet had already began to invoke the name of Yahweh, suddenly as a result from the heat of the sun, if you want to call it, or on the big 12 stones that heated up, or was it a fire from heaven? The pile of wood burst into flames, and continuously even the water in the surrounding trenches was consumed. But you know, my friends, he gave them the choice of when they wanted to start their fire. but he had a specific time in the afternoon that he waited on. Was it because these white, I imagine, shiny rocks, or maybe they were black rocks that held the heat? And so when he poured this volatile water, shall we call it, all over the animal in the trenches, it must have been some flame. Or we could say it was ignited from a spaceship remotely. But people had one cry, Yahweh God. Elijah cried out and said, "Seize these priests of Baal, don't let them escape." Then he drove down the river bank of Kishon, and here he was polluting the ecology here. He cut the throats down to the last man. Talk about polluting the streams. I believe this beyond a shadow of a doubt. If there ever were people over in Israel spent a little less time fighting with the Arabs and their neighbors, and they spent a little bit more time reading the Holy Writ, they would realize that there's oil wells in the present day, and if those Zionists would decide to dig the wells in their territory due to the biblical knowledge that tells of the existence of oil, they would find that it was definitely confirmed by Holy Writ. Now, so much for that. But let us once more take this passage as referred to in the second book of Maccabees. Now we find this action was going on was about 400 years after the reign of Ahab, and the story of Elijah is about the time when Nehemiah came back from captivity with his intention of rebuilding the cities and the walls of Jerusalem, as well as starting up the religion of Yahweh again. Well, let's not say religion, the laws and the commandments, and to follow the truth of the Heavenly Father of all these tribes. As we have abolished, as the children of Israel had been captive among all these heathen for so long, then we find that Nehemiah, after rebuilding the temple and offering as sacrifice, he went out to look for the sacred fire. Isn't that mysterious? For when our forefathers were led into Persia, the priests were then devout, and they took the fire from the altar privately, and they hid it in it tells us, a hollow place of a pit without water. There they kept it safe, so that the place was unknown to all men. After many years, about 142 years, when it pleased the Almighty God, Nehemiah being sent from the king of Persia, he did send the posterity of the priests that he had hid, or that hid it, to the fire. But on the return, they told us they found no fire, but listen to this, thick water. Get that? Thick water. Then commanded he them to draw it up and bring it. And when the sacrifice was laid out, Nehemiah commanded the priest to sprinkle the wood and the things laid upon with the water. When this was done, the time came, the sun shone, and as aforetime was hid in the clouds, there was a great fire kindled, so that every man marveled. Now you go back and you read this for yourself in the second book of Maccabees, in the first chapter, starting around the 20th verse, and you read to verse 22. I think if you weigh it out it's laid out very explicitly here, and this stuff was so volatile that just exposed to the heat of the sun, I believe that the rocks were heated up by the sun, or what, in other words, ignited the naphthalene. So let's keep in mind that Nehemiah called the great Napthar, which is to say a cleansing, but many men called it Nephi, Nephi. Now we notice in the French Jerusalem Bible, it said the story combines the memory of worship of fire among the Persians and a certain knowledge of the prophecy or properties, of this naphtha. Now the local petro, which was much admired by the Greeks and the Roman naturalists and geologists, the word came from another word, naphtha, is derived from that of petro in a raw state. In order for it to take on the appearance of water, it would have to be distilled. So the prophets of Israel, I don't doubt, and it's quite plain to me, that they knew the secret this what today we would consider a relatively simple operation that would have to be taught. Now, these teachers were capable of giving such instructions in a relatively advanced technique for their day, or technology. So, if it wasn't divine intervention that was of extraterrestrial knowledge, I'll leave it up to you, the listener. Let's go back to Elijah. So after this great man of God we find he cut off the heads of these 450 phonies, still he seemed to have a great job ahead of him. He had to make it rain, and he said it wouldn't rain till he spoke it, which was about a 3.5-year period, and I probably should avoid the subject, but I'd like you, the listener, to keep in mind that a 3.5-year period, because later on it's used again, not speaking of rain, but it's used in Daniel. It's prophetic of the last days and so forth. In fact, the day and the hour which we're living in, which ties up with Revelation, the 18th chapter, and it takes you back into the book of Daniel, and Christ talking about the abomination that makes desolation, standing in the holy place. Well, anyway, so if you want to do a study into that, we find that the great correlation here that we might deviate for a second, stop and think. Was there a period in the world where it lacked rain? Was this allegorically trying to show us an ancient idiom of the day that it was a dry and thirsty land spiritually? The book of Jude talks about deep wells and dark clouds that have no water, talking about these fallen extraterrestrials that came to this earth that have no spiritual capacity. So many times water is equated to spirit or lack of it. So we go back to Ezekiel here, and we all know the story of the Valley of the Dry Bones. We find so many people today, they're dried up and they're destitute of spirit. But I'll leave that alone because that's another story for another time. So now getting back to the personal powers of this great prophet, they were not enough that he had to rely on his faith. He must have been pretty cocky and had a lot of faith when he sent Ahab back to his palace saying, get thee up and eat and drink, for there's a sound of abundance of rain, for the sky was cloudless. Now the king, he went back to his palace, but he was still stunned by what old Elijah had done, and he climbed the summit of what was called Mount Carmel. And he sat down, he bowed his head between his knees, and it was appear that there was some sort of technical trouble that must have delayed his allies. Now, he was talking about the extraterrestrials, for the contrivances was not yet at the fixed time. Now, we find the anguish of Elijah was appalling, for he thought he'd been betrayed. And so at the end of his wait, which must have seemed like 100 years, one of his companions jumped up full of hope, and he said, behold, there arises a little cloud out of the sea. Now, my friends, remember the sea of space, like a man's hand. Now, it's talking about a weapon. No, cloud out of the sea. Many have read this and have not questioned the fact that clouds don't come up out of the water or sea. In our day, there are frequent reports of them coming in great clouds. Now, remember, we've discussed the fact that in our day that we now understand when they come out of the sea of space. In this age of technology, we understand the salting of the clouds, and also apparently these extraterrestrial ships, they have some sort of effect on our atmosphere where they create clouds about them. So I guess that they could cause rain anywhere they went. We have to remember the story that went through Jonah when he went to sea. When the sudden appearance of these clouds and thunder and lightning and storms that tossed his ship about that he was in, moving right along, we find an hour later the city of Samaria was dripping under the great rain clouds which whirled along the terraces and the narrow streets. Now imagine Elijah's face turned towards heaven, and he drank of this deliverance, and he made his way quite triumphantly, I would imagine now, then into that ivory tower. Probably standing in the doorway of her patio, Jezebel held out the palm of her hand to catch some of this liquid manna, and she was probably laughing for joy. But don't you imagine her smile disappeared from her face pretty quick when she learned that this life-giving rain had been brought about at the price of the blood of her priests and prostitutes, which were slain. Actually, it was too high a price for her to have her old fish pond filled. So the old gal, she started ranting and raving. She said, "Let God do to me, and more so, if I make not my life like one of them by tomorrow at this time." In other words, she was saying, if I don't kill that Elijah, if he's not dead, then I'm going to commit suicide. So we see here again that there wasn't any chance of royal acknowledgement for the fertility of the rain brought about by Elijah given to the country, nor was there any hope for the return of the Yahweh faith as far as she was concerned. She still didn't give up. She didn't realize when her contract was up. So Elijah realized that there was nothing left for him to do but boogie out of town. And it seemed that we would have to resume his former wandering life, and he hurried on to the area that was still known today as Beersheba, which was outside of Ahab's kingdom. And he left his companions there, and he went into the desert, and evening fell, and he sat down under a juniper tree, and he wanted to die. Is it enough? It is enough now that Yahweh take away his life, he was saying. In other words, I've had enough, Father. He said, do me in, for I am no better than my fathers. But his hour had not yet come, and he undertook on foot the pilgrimage to Sinai, a 40-day march. Sounds like he surely knew something about Moses and his account here with UFOs and this house of the Almighty called Sinai. But then we find when he reached Horeb, he climbed up to a cave near the summit, and he waited there. The night was still and calm, then behold, Yahweh passed by in his great ship. How did he pass by? He passed by in his great spaceship, and which he met Moses and Aaron, the priests and the people of Israel. With a great and a strong wind, he rent the mountain, and he brake in pieces the rocks before Yahweh. And Yahweh was not in the wind, it said, and we've already gone through that story, but the Almighty tried to explain that he wasn't in the fire, he wasn't in the wind, the earthquake, but he was in the wee, still voice. Do you have privy to that voice today? Are you listening? Are you hearing anything? I would think today, in the scientific term, you might want to call it ESP. The Almighty could read his mind, and as he can read the mind, if he can read his mind, just think if we could read the mind of the Almighty. Now Elijah, he must have been pretty close to the Almighty and able to do that. But I think actually what he was picked up. He had a face-to-face confrontation with the Almighty. Otherwise, how could he have stood on the Mount of Transfiguration with Elijah, with Moses and the Christ and the disciples? There was a phenomenon here which we show is a sign of the divine presence. But the tremendous uproar that was followed by a peaceful puff of wind, and it brought a vivid memory to him. He remembered every word from the stories of the companion of Moses. He described the first descent of the pillar of fire and the cloud in this very place, and he realized that he was going to witness from the inside of the cave the landing craft of the Cherons, as he said before, or Cherubs, or the cherubims, if you like. He hid his face, now note this, with his mantle to protect himself from radiation. Was it something in a wool blanket? Now, if we wrapped his mantle around his body and around his head, it seems very likely that he knew the story of Moses, and especially Exodus, the 19th chapter, where he warned the children of Israel, 3 different times in that one chapter. Go and sanctify yourselves. It was not a religious thing. They had been taught how to purify their bodies. Then it goes into greater explanation. Go down to the stream and wash yourselves and wash your clothes, and do not enter into your wives. and they were not to eat any animal that got too close to this great ship, because it would be contaminated with radiation. In other words, cause emerods and cancer and etc. Now, he must have known something, we're speaking of Elijah now, about radioactivity and fallout. I'm sure that there was something besides just respect. So he finally went out of his cave, or this shelter, and the terrible instructions that he received contrasted sharply with the still small voice, I want to say, that was given to him. At the end of the interview with this eternal, or this great Lord of space, whether it was the Almighty himself or whether it was a messenger, Elijah, we find next, he was sent to Samaria. He had to go there. We don't know exactly what went on in that great encounter. It's a sad thing that so much of it has been left out of the whole book, and would have probably been thrown out of our Bible anyway. It probably went into too much detail. Not only through the Dark Ages, but even through the beginning of our century, the people could not have bought it, as it seemed probably, if it was in its true text, it was too far-fetched for the simple religious to understand. Now, it would seem like a Buck Rogers comic book, so I believe that the Almighty had a good reason for this being left out of Scriptures, and we are told that Scripture was given by divine inspiration of the Holy Spirit and through the prophets of God, in other words, the secretaries, who were to write these things down. Now, as we go along the way, we find Elijah himself had an assistant here by the name of Elisha. He was quite an inspired laborer, and I imagine if you'd seen what this man had seen, following Elijah around, you'd be a little inspired too. And we find who he had met on the way. Remember, he was a fellow that was plowing in the field with 12 teams of oxen, and he knew instantaneously, I would imagine, that it was Elijah that he was to follow. Elijah was sort of a shadow, a type of the Christ, the Messiah that was to come. And then when he walked by the disciples, they dropped whatever they were doing. They followed the Master. So here we see a foreshadow, a type, an allegory. Elisha said, "Let me kiss my mother and father goodbye." And he went back and he killed a couple oxen, and he took his wooden plows and the other instruments, and he built a great barbecue for all of his neighbors. So then he boogied on down the road with Elijah, and we find the Scripture says that obedience is greater than sacrifice. So the Almighty must have given Elijah, his assistant, to lessen his burden in some degree. Elijah and Elisha, now we find what's so very interesting here, they continue to lead as supporters, or Yahweh supporters that, well, let's say, that led to the death of Ahab under his successor, Ahaziah. Now, after that time, Elijah called fire out of heaven. You might remember those stories. Or should we call it the use of flamethrowers? Somehow there's, this is how we interpret this illusion here of this fire coming out of heaven that's mentioned in the first chapter, the second book of Kings. The fire from heaven at the command from this prophet fell upon his enemies and devoured them. When Elijah saw about, the record says that he slew about 50 soldiers. And then they turn around, they sent another 50 after him, this wicked king did, and he slew those. So now we have over 100 men that got burned up instantaneously. So the news spread among Yahweh's people that in the reign of the prophets he was going to leave his friends. Now Elijah, he took off, and he took Elisha with him, and he tried to convince them that his new mission was just going to be for a short duration. But Elijah knew that the fate was in store for the chief, Well, in other words, I believe that he knew that his, what would we say, his ministry, his job on this earth, it was coming to an end, and that he was also like another that they called a seventh from Adam, this mysterious Enoch that never saw death, and he knew that he was to leave the earth one day to go to another place where death had no power over him. We find that this happened, as I said before, we trace back to the days of Enoch, even before the flood, back in Genesis 4:24, and we find it also in the book of Ecclesiasticus, and you find it mentioned in Hebrews. It tells us that Elisha knew and he wanted to see, and it says that he did see. And they crossed Jordan, like they sing about at so many of our barbaric funerals that we hold, where we won't have to cross Jordan anymore. And he went to this appointed place, which obviously it was to see. Was it possibly referring to a third or a fourth dimension? Did they have which I believe, it was a scientific ability to operate their ships and all at such a high vibratory rate that man fails to understand how his eye is so limited to a two-dimensional. But then we would be getting into a lot of science and try to explain things that, in all honesty, we don't know, but, or let's say I don't, and can only guess at. So we see that they saw the great spaceships of the Most High that had surrounded them, or what we would call, or the religious world would call, guardian angels, these extraterrestrials. They said that they're Elisha talking with Elijah, he said, there's more with us than be against us. Now, if you go back through the life of Elijah, where there were 7 great miracles recorded on his behalf, raising the dead and healing the sick and so forth, we find that Elijah asked for twice the power of Elisha. Isn't that odd? Maybe, folks, this is why we're have-nots. Because we don't ask. So consequently, we don't receive. It's like you're sitting at the table and one of your children saying, why didn't you pass me the salt? Say, well, you didn't ask. Well, I was hoping you would. And so Elijah told him that this is a hard thing that you ask. But if the Almighty allows you to see me go, then you shall receive these things, or your request. So they went and they to an appointed spot across Jordan, or the other side, and there was a luminous craft that descended rapidly till it came to the sight of the 2 men, and Elijah was taken away. Now here's what we might note, my friends. We hear the accounts, and we've quoted them to you from the different translations. He was taken up in a whirlwind. It's a description of the oscillating, turning motion of this ship. But then, as we quoted from Fenton, I believe it was, or Moffat, Elisha said, behold, I've seen the chariots of God and the horses of God. And so, throughout past chapters, I think that we've made it quite clear through the concordance and the translation, the old idioms, showing the different types of ships. No, he didn't go off in just one little ship. My friend, this was such a great man of the Almighty, such an obedient person who had faith and relied on our Father in outer space, that he was taken up with an accompanying armada. So Elijah was taken away, and he bid his farewells to Elisha, and the chariots of fire that began to raise rapidly in a diagonal direction when touched the tops of the groups of the palm trees. I would imagine Elijah or Elisha was probably half drunk with fear and excitement. That tells us that he remained rooted to the ground, calling Elijah with all the strength that he had. But nothing was left of Elijah, save for this mysterious mantle that we've covered in other chapters, which had fallen to the ground. You'll find that in 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, 11 to 13. And it tells us that it came to pass, and they still went on, and they talked with the Almighty, and behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire. Then they parted them asunder, and Elijah was caught up in a great whirlwind to heaven. Elijah saw it, and he cried, my Father, the chariots of fire and the horsemen thereof. And as we told you before, that the horses denote warships symbolically, and said that they saw no more. And he took a hold of his own clothes, and he tore them in pieces. Now why? We pointed out before, because they were contaminated with radiation. And also he took up the mantle of Elijah as it fell on him, and he went back, and he stood on the bank of Jordan at that time. And then these 3 verses were written. We understand the word chariot as the only thing that he knew to use to describe a fast vehicle. The word fire denotes the source of life. Now in other parts of our other chapters, I think that we've covered the great war that took place. Well, I had intended to, let's say. I was going to cover the war of 1914 to 18, when they talked about the battle that took place in France, and they talked about the angels of Mons and all of that. Although there were supposedly many written accounts, I think this was a ploy by the English government to once again jack the people up to go fight against their German neighbors. And they used all this falderall to try to get them to believe that they were fighting on the side of God as they killed their brethren and Christian neighbors, those of their own household or same race and same faith. And after inspecting that and going through it, I have decided to delete it, because I believe that it was one of the great farces that has been perpetrated on us, and accentuated and further perpetrated by these writers of UFO books and all, and I think it's a bunch of hogwash. Remember now, the word whirlwind, as it's employed as in other biblical passages, as something on similar occasions, that they had the idea that they were trying to convey to you the moving circular motion, exactly like the wheels that we've gone into, the wheels of Ezekiel. Now, on one final note that we would like to have you consider, as justice for all of the ramification for the uses of the word heavy water may not have been fully explained, and I think that you'll find out during the Second World War that the American Air Force, they blew up some plants in Germany where they distilled or made what is called heavy water. They were actually distilling hydrogen from it. And as we know, that Germany at the end of the war was very close to having the ability to create these, they had created some rockets, but if they had been given a little more time, we would probably all be speaking German. In other words, the prototype to the ICBMs. And so there's a lot more to heavy water than the average person ever knew or ever even considered, and most people don't know that does and did exist. And it was at the end of the war that our government, we captured a lot of the German scientists, and then we shared them like cattle with the Russians. How stupid can we get? Talk about a bunch of dumb white boys. But one of the leading scientists who has been a great help to America, was the von Braun. He was one of the leaders of the technology, of knowing how and using the hydrogen as rocket fuel. There's a possibility that the people of old, that they knew a lot more about this heavy water, and they used it for more things than is probably related to in the Bible. And my friends, I think that this Tower of Babel, there's a lot of people say it's here and there, but nobody has ever really proved it to my satisfaction. And I think that what they were doing was building a tower, as I said before, like the one you find in Florida, and they were getting ready to launch a ship using this heavy water or rocket fuel to go out into the heavens or outer space, if you like. Now there's a scripture that says that all things that are hid shall be revealed, and all things that are covered shall be uncovered. Many years ago, a friend of mine told me about a man, about the time of the Second World War, who was quite a chemist and an engineer, and he had a formula that he could use seawater and run an automobile on it by merely adding a few simple chemical components that you would buy at your corner drugstore. Apparently many people laughed at him, and he went to the drugstore and he bought some of these over-the-counter chemicals that did not require a prescription. He drove his car down to the ocean front. They drained the gas tank, tried to start it, proved there wasn't any gas left in it. Then he took a bucket of seawater and he mixed these chemicals into it, got back in the car, started it up, and drove it away. Now he had this formula which could have revolutionized the world and given us an unexhaustible amount or a source for fuel that would not contaminate our world. Now, the world could have traveled on just pennies a day, but this man suddenly and mysteriously, he disappeared. Needless to say, there was foul play suspected. So I believe as we come into what is referred to as the Kingdom Age, there's going to be inexpensive, reasonable fuel acquirable for the people without being subject to high places or high prices that are controlled by a few distilling these contaminating petroleum byproducts. Think about this, that when no longer we're ruled over by usury, high taxes, you'll only have to pay the tithe, 10% of your increase. There will not be pollutants. Everybody will be interested in ecology. Well, as Revelation says, and the increase of his government, and I would say the knowledge thereof, shall be without end, when men learn to build and to create, and the knowledge to destroy is over. As, who was it, Isaiah said that they shall beat their swords into plowshares, an old idiom. So we thank you for listening, and we ask you to write to us. We'd like to hear from you and what you think of these tapes. We hope that they're an inspiration to you. So write Pilgrim Ships, P.O. Box 1086, Lakeview, Missouri. This is hopefully your friend, Noel Fredericks, signing off. Oh, by the way, I think I forgot the zip. 65737. Thank you for listening.